Okay, so I think we're more or less all in a room now, and we only have half an hour for this, so we're going to get started straight away. So lots of questions to get through. Just going to ask for fairly kind of pithy answers, if that's okay. Rebecca and Chris. And there are a few kind of similar questions, so I'm going to group those together and ask for an answer. But we're going to, I think, probably jump into the really kind of, I guess, the big question. This one's to you, Rebecca, but Chris may also want to comment on this. That's, is the proof 100% correct or just a guess looking at statistics? Evidence is being released to say climate change is due to gases pollution. Have opposing views been scientifically investigated?
So we are very, very certain that it is the activities of humans that are causing global warming. And the scientific community which looks at this is overwhelmingly of that view. So I say that with confidence because there is a scientific community across the world under the banner of the United Nations that is set up to look at this issue, and they speak with increasing clarity about how it is humans that have been causing the recent global warming. There is, however, still uncertainty in this, so while we can be very clear that the science points to, as greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere grow, so too does the temperature, there are a set of things that are more uncertain about what impact that will have overall. So here we are always very cautious to say that temperatures are going up, but the impacts, particularly in the natural world, are harder to predict. And you heard Ed talk about some of those things earlier. So it's very difficult to know with complete clarity about what happens, for example, if the ice sheets that Ed talked about were to disappear. So that will change weather patterns, that will change some of the extreme events that come with that. So that's where it's best to say there is still uncertainty, but there is an extraordinarily high degree of clarity and certainty from the scientific community about the impact that we're having from human actions. And it's worth saying that it has been a long time that we can understand that. There's empirical evidence of it happening, and we've known about it for a very long time, that by burning fossil fuels we are growing the stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and with it the temperature.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. So there are quite a few questions for Rebecca about education. So I'm going to take them all in one go. So it's, how do we educate people? How do we convince people to help act on climate change? What is the role of education in climate change from a young age? And do we need more education about climate change, including, but not just in schools?
Great, thank you. Yes, well, education is a really important part of this, and I think generally speaking people under the age of about 30 might have studied climate change at school. I'm too old to have studied climate change at school, even though the science was very well known 30 or 40 years ago. So education is really important. One of the things that I've been involved in is actually a programme of education of members of parliament, so that they have the same kinds of information and discussions with scientists that you're having this morning. So it's really important that we work with politicians, with people in government, and with businesses to help them to understand that science. What I would say, though, and something that we'll be discussing over the course of the Assembly, is that it's not just about getting everyone to understand the facts so that they can act. It's also about making those changes to the way that our economy works, and making it easier for people to make the changes that they need to make in their lives. And that's something that I think it will probably be a theme running through the weekends that we have.
Great, thank you very much, Rebecca. So coming to you next, Chris. So a couple of questions about kind of consumption versus, I guess, the net zero target. So where do the UK's emissions start and end? For example, aviation, shipping, manufacturing, electricity generation. There's also one, what are the implications for consumption emissions after we leave the EU?
These are really good questions. So we have a really good set of statistics amongst the world's best about how we are producing greenhouse gas emissions here in the UK. So that is by and large through the burning of fossil fuels. So just to take an example, the aviation example, for example, we can look at the fuel that is used to fuel up the planes, and that is measured each year, that leave from airports in the UK. And we have brilliant statistics, of course, on how we're using petrol and diesel for road transport. Similarly, right across the whole of all of the bits of that pie chart that I showed you earlier, we have really, really strong data. So we are, I'm very certain that that data is accurate. What's harder, and it is much harder, is to say what impact we have beyond the borders of the UK. So when we import, a really good example of this, most of us in this room will have a mobile phone. So that mobile phone will not have been constructed here, it will have been made somewhere else. If you look at that mobile phone, it has hundreds, if not thousands of components within it, things like the glass on the front of it, the plastic, the chips within it. Each of those components might have come from a different place in the world. Each of the manufacturing processes to make it will have had some fossil fuels associated with it. And knowing what impact we are having by buying that is extremely difficult. Now, there are good academics here in this country who look at that issue, and they can say in broad brush terms that the impact that we have from those consumption emissions, if I can call it that, that's the emissions associated with all the products that we buy, including the things that we import, are about 50% or so higher than the emissions that we produce here directly. So it's difficult because you need to, in that circumstance, be able to track every one of the components and know exactly where it was built. So and made and how it was made. So that's a very difficult thing to do overall. And that's one of the reasons why the United Nations, when it looks at the global issue of climate change, asks each country to look at the production emissions. So let's imagine for a second that that phone I've referred to was made in China. The emissions in China are something that the UN asks the Chinese government to look at, and it has made commitments. China has one of the countries that has made commitments to reduce those production emissions. If every country in the world gets to net zero, then the consumption emissions problem goes away as well. So we'll be consuming goods from wherever they're made in the world, in the knowledge that that's net zero emissions in that country too. And that's a good way of thinking about the global challenge, is that each country of the world has to get its own emissions down to zero as much as possible. And there are ways to do that through what we consume, but that's not what the net zero target is about. It looks at the emissions produced here in the UK.
Great, thank you, Chris. So coming back to you, Rebecca, and a few around the politics of the issue. So why are people in high places with authority not pushing the issue? Why have we not acted sooner? Why have we waited until things get serious? And linked to that, how can we hold politicians to account? And where does Trump and the USA stand on this?
Okay. So why are people in high places not pushing the issue? Well, I mean, that very much depends who you're talking about. So if you are a company which digs fossil fuels out of the ground or uses fossil fuels, then you might be worried about any regulation that would stop you doing that. And so you might not take action as quickly as you can. You could say that companies haven't acted because they want government to show them the way, that government needs to set regulations to allow those companies to be cleaner and lower carbon. So it's the reason about why different people in power haven't acted yet is quite complicated. Why haven't we acted sooner? I mean, generally speaking, as we said this morning, we've known about the science for a very long time. But I think that it is quite a difficult thing to face up to, and because it's a long-term problem, then there's not as much of an incentive as there might be to do something right now. So, if there was an immediate problem like smog, for example, acid rain, you can see it in the air. You can see that there's smog caused by pollution, and you can deal with it quite quickly. Whereas because climate change isn't immediately visible, then you might not want to, you might not see the urgency of acting. But we've got to the stage now where action really is urgent, where we really need to act quickly. And lastly, where does Trump and the US stand on this? Well, the US signed the Paris Agreement. That was under President Obama. And then when Trump was elected, he said that he would pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, which would leave them the only, I'm right in saying, aren't I, Chris, the only country of all the countries in the world, nearly 200. The US is the only one that has said that they'll withdraw from this international agreement on climate change. You know, I can't second guess what President Trump thinks about this, and if you look at his statements on climate change, they're quite contradictory. But what I would say is that in the US there is a National Academy of Sciences, which is basically is the sort of association that represents scientists in the US, and they have published very public statements that they are concerned about climate change, and they agree with they agree that there's an urgent need to act. So it's become a very political issue in the US as a result.
So coming to you next, Chris. So this one starts with a statement. The UK's net zero target is unattainable over 30 years. It's practically impossible to achieve and would be optimistic to achieve 50%. Do you agree?
No. And I say that with some confidence because it's really my job to point out how it can be achieved. Now, we are going to get onto this tomorrow, so I'm not going to try and take you through it all. But the important thing to say in response to that is that the target is achievable, and indeed we can put lots of evidence around that, and we can say that there are steps that can be taken to get to the net zero goal by 2050, if not even earlier. We could talk about that too. But of course there are practical constraints to that. So there are a host of ways in which we use fossil fuels at the moment, and they're really important to the way that we live our lives. So you've heard from Becky already, and indeed you've heard from the others this morning. It is the change in those things that makes it difficult. So it is practically possible to do this. It is, we have all the technologies at our disposal to do it, and in fact it doesn't involve a huge number of new things at all, but the changes needed in society and in the economy and indeed in your lives are the hard bit about this. Now, tomorrow I will take you through the advice that we gave to the government last year that led to the setting of the target that we now have in law. And it wasn't just that we recommended that we have that target, we also gave an indication of how we felt it could be met. So that's what I'm going to tell you about tomorrow. I am not right about this, so I have some sense about how you could do it, but the only thing I know about that is that it's only my view in 2019. So the steps that will be needed to get to that target, remember the target is law, the steps to get to it are not law. So that's where the interesting stuff comes, and that's what you are all here to talk about, because it's your view on which of those things you wish to see happen that is so important. That's the thing that we don't have lots of good evidence about. So you've got lots of people like me who can tell you about the technologies, we can talk about the science, but we don't know is how you bring all that together and what we need to do to bring it about overall. So that's the interesting thing, but it can be done, and it definitely can be done.
So a few for you, Becky, around companies. So the first one is name and shame companies opposed to climate change. I'm going to leave you to decide whether or not you want to do that, or kind of how that might be done. But I guess there are set then around actually how industry might be encouraged to make the change. So how can we get industry to move away from fossil fuels, financial incentives, legislation, with corporations and manufacturers, preventing positive change? What incentives can be put in place to make these necessary changes happen? And can government create a law that makes companies show the effects they're having on the environment in the products they sell?
Great. On naming and shaming companies, I think that leads into an answer to some of the other issues. I mean, one way of helping companies to reduce emissions and also pointing out those companies that aren't reducing emissions is by providing better information and and requiring companies to produce information about what they've invested in, what their carbon emissions are, and what their plans are to tackle climate change. And there's increasingly demands are being made of companies to provide that better information. And you know that you might think that's a necessary step in order for them to take responsibility, and in order for them to in order for it to be obvious which companies are doing the right thing and which might not be. But there is a balance to be struck between just providing better information and then actually things that governments can do to regulate or to change the way that prices work, to basically reward companies who do the right thing, and make it harder for companies to do business and pollute a lot at the same time. So, for example, if you can provide incentives for companies to get their electricity from renewable energy. You can put a price on fossil fuel. You can put a tax on fossil fuels so that it's more expensive to use fossil fuels compared with alternatives. There are ways of adjusting the price system, and you might also just want to decide that some things have to be banned altogether. So, for example, the UK has decided that by 2025, within 5 years, we will no longer be producing electricity through coal-fired generation. So they've just put an end date on it. You know, within 5 years, that won't happen anymore. And the good thing about that is that it allows certainty that, you know, we know we're not going to be doing that anymore because the government said we can't. So it's kind of a very it's a very certain signal. It's black and white. So there's a range of ways in which we can get companies to help us in this, and I think in this afternoon's session we're going to be going through that in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Becky. A few for you as well, Chris, around companies. So if there's anything you want to add to what Becky's just said. So the first one is industry produces 21% of emissions. Shouldn't we address how industry can cut emissions? And I'll give you a second one as well alongside that. Is the reduced manufacturing industry in the UK responsible for the reduced GHG emissions vis-a-vis the growth in the country?
So let me deal first with that. If I can, that last question, I might actually ask you, Tim, to repeat the first one because I can't remember. But we'll get onto that in a second. The manufacturing story is really interesting. So we used to be a country that had lots of heavy industry here. So we used a lot of. I'm from Glasgow. So Glasgow was a place where you had lots of people burning fossil fuels, coal, for all the industrial processes. Lots of things like foundries and. You know, that in many ways that was the formation of the city that I live in now. We don't have those now, but most of that happened a long time ago. The recent reductions that we've so some of the long-term reductions in the UK's greenhouse gas emissions have come from losing heavy industry, but that's all really pre-1990, mostly at least. The stuff that's come next has actually been a more interesting story, and there are two things really that have driven that. One is that we've become less reliant on very dirty fossil fuels, coal, and more reliant on things like gas, which are slightly cleaner when you burn them. And secondly, and this is to my mind much more interesting, we've become more energy efficient. So let me explain what that means. We've been much better at using the energy from fossil fuels more effectively. Now that plays out right across every industry, actually. So it means that for every unit of production in any sector, we're using less fossil fuels. And that story's been really what's been driving those two things together, the switch from coal to the alternatives, and the industry's become more energy efficient overall, as indeed have you, the consumer. You know, the television in your house, for example, is much more energy efficient than the old one you would have had in the 80s. So that story has been what's driving emissions down overall in the UK, but we will run out of road with that story soon unless we start to make the next set of switches to very clean alternatives. Again, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but it is not the case that we've simply been pushing industries to other parts of the world. There is a more interesting story overall.
So the first question was, industry produces 21% of emissions. Shouldn't we address how industry can cut emissions? Can I just check with which table put this one forward? Is that to do with the Climate Assembly addressing it, or addressing it more broadly? Does anybody recognise that question? The Climate Assembly.
Well, I really hope you do address it, because I think it's so important. So you see that it's a fifth of the total, 21%. It's about a fifth of the total emissions that we produce at the moment come from industry. Now, the steps to get that to zero or near zero are one of the most interesting and difficult sets of decisions that we face in the UK. And the reason for that is, if we only cared about climate and we only cared about emissions and we only cared about the UK, then what you could do very quickly is say, right, we're not going to have any more of that industry, we'll just close all those industries and they'll happen somewhere else. That would be a really daft thing to do from the perspective of the climate, because the climate doesn't care where those emissions come from. So pushing industry out to another place of the world, potentially a dirtier place that doesn't have the regulations that are as tight as the UK, is not a good decision from the climate's perspective. But it's also not a good decision from the perspective of people who work in those industries and who have worthwhile jobs and, you know, families and income. So the task is overall to get those emissions down whilst maintaining industry here in the UK. And that is not an easy thing to pull off, although we can have a good discussion about the ways in which you would do that. What I can say is that there are alternatives for those industries to using fossil fuels. Some of them might cost more, in which case there's an interesting question whether you might try and protect industry from some of those costs, those additional costs of switching to the non-fossil fueled alternatives. That's what I would call a policy decision. That's something that government and industry together might want to try and resolve. And again, in your discussions, when it comes to the question of what you do about those industrial emissions, from my mind, the key question is, how do you do it in such a way that you retain the employment and the industry and the impact on the economy whilst reducing emissions overall?
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we're going to try and get through as many of these questions in that time. So there are a couple that were quite similar for the two of you. One is, what is the proportion of CO2 emitted by humans versus the amount produced naturally? And the other one was, what is the CO2 baseline for net zero, and how is this tracked to solar activity? Either of you? I mean, I can pass it to the other two panelists.
It might be better to Joe Hay, who you heard earlier, will have a ready answer on the CO2 emission. I could have a stab at it, but it's better I don't guess. What was the second one? And I can.
So the second one was, what is the CO2 baseline for net zero? How is this tracked to solar activity?
So let me deal first on the baseline issues. Now, we in the place I work, we use 1990 as a baseline. Now, there's lots of reasons why 1990 is a good baseline, but globally, we tend to think of 1990 as the point from which we measure the reductions that are necessary. One of the reasons is that it's from that point onwards, we had the United Nations focusing on the problem of climate change globally, and it's also from that point onwards that we have a good set of data from which to work. 1990 has no particular relevance. It's not a particular date that we look at, but it's often said to be the baseline against which you measure the percentage reductions. The interesting thing about net zero is it doesn't really matter what date you measure the reduction from, because the importance of getting to net zero emissions is it's the equivalent of a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions overall. So you can measure that from any point onwards. So I wouldn't worry. I would encourage you rather not to worry about what the baseline is, but instead think about the goal, which is to get all emissions down to, in a net basis, zero. And we can talk more on that if you're interested over the course of the next 4 weekends.
Great. Coming to you next, Becky. And sort of first of these is, do electric cars still need fossil-fueled energy to recharge? And I think kind of linked to that is the second one. Why aren't we given full environmental impact of suggested improvements, e.g. electric cars and extra electricity required?
Great, thanks. So electric cars get the electricity they need from the electricity grid. The electricity grid is increasingly, there's more and more renewable energy on that electricity grid. So the proportion of renewable and nuclear, which is a low carbon fuel, on the electricity grid is going up and up. But it is true that at the moment, if you plug in an electric car, some of the electricity that's used will come from fossil fuels. You can, as an individual, you can choose an electricity tariff which is 100% renewable, so you can choose to power your car with renewable energy. But if you haven't made that choice, then it will come from a mixture of fuels. So you can tackle that through electricity generation, and that's been one of the big successes over the past 10 years, that we have hugely reduced the amount of CO2 that we produce through electricity generation, and that's likely to continue. But as we move to electric cars, we will of course need more electricity altogether. So we not only have to, the electricity we produce, we have to change that to low carbon electricity, and we also need more electricity altogether if we're going to switch to electric vehicles. Why aren't we given the full environmental impact of suggested improvements like electric cars? Well, I think increasingly there is more information available. It's quite a complex area, so if you're looking at, for example, the carbon emissions from an iPhone, you have to track it back to where it was made in China, and as Chris said, the CO2 emissions involved in producing that iPhone will be for China to look after. Then you've got the emissions from shipping it here, and then you've got the emissions from using electricity to charge your phone. So it's quite a complicated picture, but we're getting better and better at providing information about what the footprint, if you like, what the carbon footprint is of all those products. And I think we're at the stage now where we can make a really good estimate of those products, and there have been some experiments about carbon labelling, where you actually put the amount of CO2 that a product might be responsible for on the product itself. But we haven't done, it's possible now to do that, but there hasn't been a huge amount of that information provided.
Great. Coming to you now, Chris. What are the best ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? And secondly, how is it measured for reducing emissions? I.e., how do you know how much a tree absorbs, and how do you account for tree growth, bushes, etc.?
Again, such a good question. So, I mean, there's the first thing to say is that the best thing to do is to reduce, the most efficient thing to do really is reduce the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere in the first place. Just to get the wording of the question right, Tim, so I'll make sure I answer it properly on how do we know. Sorry, I'll take it. So what are the best ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? Well, that's step one. The second way of doing it is to do something that absorbs the carbon that's in the atmosphere. And the easiest thing to do is to grow something, because it's the food for a tree, for example. So the best way, having got emissions down, of reducing the amount that's then left in the atmosphere is by natural carbon storage. That is most obviously growing a tree. We can also think about making, the soils, peatland soils, for example, absorb carbon too. There are also a set of technologies that can take the carbon from the atmosphere, and then we can lock that carbon away and store it. Now, they are newer technologies. We know what to do with them, but they're very expensive, and you need electricity to make them work. Sometimes that's called direct air capture. Some people think that's the way to do this, that we should have lots of these things. They actually look like fans. You can suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then store it away. But the amount of energy required to do that is the other thing. So there's no easy answer to any of this, really. You can't just, if you're going to do that, if that's your strategy, then fair enough. You've got to put them somewhere. They will take up a big bit of space, and you need to plug them in. So, that, and where does the electricity come from that in the first place? So overall, the simplest strategy is to cut the emissions that are going into the atmosphere in the first place, and then secondly, to look firstly at the kind of natural way in which you can then draw down the carbon from the atmosphere. And how is it measured is such a difficult topic, and every year we understand a bit more about those natural stores of carbon and the degree to which they are actually storing carbon. So every tree as it grows will suck up a different amount of carbon. You could think about, for example, some of the species of conifer that grow really quickly, and they're really thin and they grow really tall. We don't typically find them in the UK, but they're a really quick way of storing carbon. We know quite a lot about those. Some of the other things we know less about. So the soils I mentioned is something that every year we understand more and more the science of that. And actually, the more we understand of the peatland story, is the less we think that peatland has been storing away carbon, and actually might actually become a source of carbon, because as it dries out, all the carbon that's stored is emitted again. So the natural stores of carbon are something that every year scientists try and improve our understanding of.
Thank you, Chris. So unfortunately, we've run out of time with Chris and Becky for now, but fortunately they are two of our expert leads, so they'll be present for much of the assembly. We'll make sure that we take away the few questions that we haven't got to and try to find ways to answer them across the rest of the assembly. Can we just say a really big thank you to Chris and Becky? So I think it's time for the two of you to move upstairs, and we should have two new speakers coming in almost immediately. I think they might be just outside the door.